By the time I crawled into my tent that first night, I had already checked the tree line behind me so many times it started to feel automatic, like tightening a pack strap or making sure I'd actually turned my stove off. It wasn't even because I'd seen anyone. That's the part that still gets to me. I hadn't. The whole day had been the kind of day I usually go out there for in the first place. Long stretches of wind, cold salt in the air, nothing but surf and gulls, and my own footfall in the damp sand. Exactly what I wanted. But once the lights started going gray, I couldn't stop noticing how much of that coastline lets you see forever in one direction and almost nothing in another. Ocean wide open on one side, then grass and driftwood and low ridges, then the darker line farther back where the trees begin. You can feel how far you are from everybody out there. Usually I like that. Usually that makes my head quiet. That night it didn't. I was sitting cross-legged in the tent doorway eating one of those sad vacuum-packed pasta things that somehow tastes like warm cardboard no matter what brand you buy, and I heard 3 short whistles from the trees behind camp. Clean, sharp, evenly spaced. Then nothing. The thing that got me wasn't really the whistles. It was how much it sounded like whoever made them expected an answer. I do a lot of solo miles, so being out by myself wasn't unusual for me at all. If anything, I prefer it. I train for endurance races, and when I'm in a heavier block, I'll use long trail weekends instead of doing all my time on dirt roads near home. That was the whole point of the Lost Coast trip. 2 days, decent weather, low traffic during the week, enough elevation and loose footing to make my legs work without turning it into some big epic sufferfest. I wanted something remote but manageable. Just enough discomfort to feel good later. I packed the way I always do, probably more methodically than most normal people would bother with. I had everything portioned out in freezer bags, electrolytes in one side pocket, headlamp batteries rubber banded together, wind shell rolled tight at the top. I even brought the pair of socks I call my bailout socks, which are just an older dry pair I keep sealed until I really need the mental boost. If you spend enough time doing long efforts alone, you end up with all these little systems like that, tiny ways to keep yourself steady. The first day was almost boring in the best possible way. Clear sky, decent visibility, trail conditions better than I'd expected. The tide windows were fine, so I wasn't rushing. I saw one couple way back near the earlier section, and nobody after that. I remember thinking around lunch that this was exactly why I came on a weekday. No speakers clipped to backpacks. No one trying to make small talk while I'm chewing a bar and watching the water. I stopped at a sandy stretch near the shoreline around early afternoon, mostly to eat and knock some grit out of my shoe. That's when I noticed the second set of footprints. At first, I didn't think much of it. Sand holds a lot of traffic stories longer than dirt does, and when you follow a coast path, people overlap all the time without ever actually seeing each other. The prints were roughly in my direction, maybe a little offset from mine. I assumed somebody had been through earlier, and I was only now clocking them because the light changed and the impressions were more obvious. That made total sense. I didn't stand there and invent anything dramatic. I just looked at them for a second, shrugged, and sat down to eat. I had a tortilla with peanut butter folded around a smashed banana, which is ugly but works, and one of those lemon electrolyte chews that always taste too sweet when it's cold. I remember brushing sand off my calves and looking out at the water and thinking I still had a good time before I needed to start searching for camp. It was calm enough that I could hear the tiny hiss the foam makes when it pulls back over pebbles. No voices, no gear noise, just the ocean. When I got up maybe 20 minutes later, I turned to shoulder my pack and saw where the footprints ended. Not nearby, right where I'd been sitting. It looked like whoever made them had walked up behind where I was eating, stopped there for a while, then turned back out of the sand. I stood there staring at it longer than I want to admit, trying to make it mean something simpler. Maybe I had missed older prints crossing at an angle. Maybe the edges only looked sharper because of the dampness. Maybe they weren't even one person's, maybe several partial prints were just overlapping. Sand can do that. Your brain likes patterns. It wasn't hard to come up with explanations. Still, I checked the beach in both directions before I put my pack on. Nothing. After that, I started doing that thing where you pretend you haven't changed your behavior even though you absolutely have. I still walked at my normal pace, but I was listening differently. I still stopped to drink, but faster. I looked behind me more often, always trying to make it seem casual, like I was just checking the surf or the route or the cliffs. There was never anyone there. That was the part that kept letting me reset. If I'd actually seen another hiker, even a weird one, I could filed the whole thing somewhere. But instead, it was just small notes of wrongness with space around them. By late afternoon, the wind picked up enough that I put on my old blue shell, the one with the fraying cuff that snags on Velcro. I found a flat spot above the beach with enough shelter to pitch for the night. Not ideal, but good enough. I set camp the way I always do. Shoes lined up under the vestibule, pack covered, food handled, headlamp where I could grab it blind. I remember moving one fist-sized rock away from the side of my backpack because it was right where my hand kept landing, and I didn't want it digging into the fabric. That detail matters later, which is annoying, because it was such a stupid small thing at the time. I ate dinner with the tent door open, because the weather was still holding, and the light stayed around forever, the way it does out there. Once it finally started dropping, the world got flatter. The beach turned into one long gray shape. The ridges behind the camp darkened faster than the water. That was when I heard the whistles, 3 of them, from the trees. They weren't loud enough to feel urgent, which almost made them worse. Just controlled, deliberate. I sat still with the fork halfway to my mouth, waiting for a voice after them. Nothing came. I listened for a whistle back. Nothing. I told myself it was probably another camper trying to locate a friend. People do dumb signaling stuff outdoors all the time. It didn't even have to be close. Sound carries weird near shore, so I waited. Then I called out, "Hey, you good?" The words felt ridiculous as soon as they left my mouth because the coastline just swallowed them. No answer. No movement that I could pick up. Just wine pressing the tent wall inward and the far surf working at the rocks. I shut the tent not long after that. Not because I thought somebody was about to walk into camp, exactly. More because the open doorway had started feeling like a screen with something behind it. My headlamp beam only made that worse. It lit up individual blades of grass and driftwood edges, but didn't really give me anything useful past a certain distance. Every time I snapped it toward the dark, I felt like I was showing exactly where I was and getting nothing back. That's the watched feeling, I guess. Not that you see someone looking at you. Moreover, you start thinking about how visible you are. I'd instanced especially well. Not terrible, just light. Trail sleep. Every zipper noise sounds important. Every gust makes the tent fabric tick. At some point in the night, I woke up and listened so hard I could hear my own pulse in one ear against the sleeping pad. Nothing was obviously wrong, so eventually I went back down. In the morning, the air had that cold, all-damp smell the coast gets before the sun really reaches anything. My hands were stiff while I broke camp. I unzipped the vestibule, grabbed for my pack, and stopped. That same rock I had moved the evening before was sitting on top of it. Not beside it, not under it because I kicked it. Right on top, dead center on the brain of the pack. I just looked at it for a few seconds. I know how that sounds. It's a rock, big deal. But when you're alone that far out, your brain starts sorting everything by intention. A gull didn't do that. The wind didn't do that. I didn't do it in my sleep. Somebody had picked it up and set it there. I took it off and turned in a full circle, scanning way slower than I had the day before. The morning was clear enough that I could see a good distance along the open sections. Nobody on the beach, nobody on the ridges I could make out. No tents nearby, no smoke, no bright jacket moving. I packed faster than I usually would. And then I still told myself I was overreacting. That's what bugs me now. Even after the prints, even after the whistles, even after that stupid rock. I still kept defaulting to the most harmless version because the alternative would have meant admitting I was more than 6 miles from the nearest trailhead with no reliable help and no idea who else was out there. I think when you're used to being alone, you trust yourself a little too much. You think if there were real danger, you'd know. You think your experience would protect you from being the kind of person who misses it. The second day stayed almost normal on purpose, like the trail itself was trying to give me enough ordinary details to talk myself down. The light was good. I got into a steady pace. I ate a bar while walking. I even took my binoculars out once to watch a line of pelicans low over the water because that's the kind of stupidly calm thing I do when I'm settled. Every few minutes, though, I'd feel that pressure between my shoulder blades that makes you want to turn around before you know why. Sometimes I found footprints again in the softer sections. Sometimes I didn't. When I did see them, they were never clear enough for me to do anything useful with them. Just enough to feel familiar. Similar stride, similar direction, similar size. If I sped up, after a while, the next sandy patch would show them again, like whoever it was had sped up too. If the terrain turned rocky and I lost all sign, I'd start telling myself the whole thing had been in my head. Then the beach would open again, and there they were. I stopped taking real breaks, just a little standing pause to drink. I hated how that felt because it meant the trail was now being set by somebody I couldn't prove existed. I remember getting irritated at that more than scared for a while. Like, no, I planned this trip. I'm not gonna let some weird maybe person dictate my miles. Around late afternoon, the weather started changing. You could smell it first, that colder mineral smell before rain, and the light lost contrast. I was moving along a higher section above the shore when I got a feeling so sudden I actually stopped mid-step. I looked back across a ridgeline behind me. A person was standing there, far enough away that at first they were just vertical shape and stillness. No color I could trust, no face. Just a figure on the skyline where there should not have been one, completely motionless, not hiking, not adjusting gear, not doing anything you'd expect someone on trail to do. I took my binoculars off my chest so fast I fumbled them once. When I got them up, the lenses were shaking a little from my hands, but I saw enough. The person had something reflective held up in front of them, angled right at me. It flashed once when the light caught it. Glass, maybe, a lens, binoculars, I don't know. But it was pointed directly in my direction in a way that made it obvious they weren't just standing there by accident. They were tracking me, watching where I stopped. I don't know why I did this, but I lifted one hand, not a wave, more like a stupid involuntary "I see you." The figure stepped behind the ridge and disappeared immediately. No hesitation, no looking around, just gone. That was the moment everything I had been explaining away fell into place all at once, and my body caught up before my thoughts did. My mouth went dry, my fingers started feeling clumsy inside my gloves. I turned and kept moving, not running yet because the footing there was uneven and loose, but fast enough that my calves started barking. Every few seconds, I looked over my shoulder, half expecting to see the top of a head come back over the ridgeline. I never did, which somehow made it worse. Now I knew there was somebody back there, but I didn't know if they were staying put, following higher up, cutting across, or already closer than I thought. By the time I found a place I could camp, the sky had flattened into that heavy silver color that means the weather isn't asking anymore. I got the tent up in a rush I wouldn't normally allow myself. Bad pitch angles, sloppy lines, one corner not as clean as I wanted. I didn't care. I got inside before the rain really came and kept my headlamp off as long as I could stand it. Once the dark settled, the storm moved in hard. The rain on the tent was loud enough that I should felt safer, I guess. It covered smaller sounds, but every gap in it mattered more. When the wind shifted and the rain softened for a few seconds, I'd hear something out beyond the reach of the headlamp. A crunch, then nothing. A few slow steps on wet ground, then nothing. Once, from what sounded like the backside of camp, I heard movement circle from left to right and stop. Not close enough to touch the tent. Close enough that I held my breath without meaning to. I finally clicked the headlamp on and aimed it through the fabric. All it gave me was rain, bright and slanting, and the warped shadow of beach grass bending low. I kept thinking that if someone really wanted to come in, the tent wall was nothing. Just nylon and a zipper. All my careful packing, all my race training, all the little systems I rely on, none of it meant much in that moment. I wasn't thinking about pace or route or tide anymore. I was lying there in damp clothes with one hand on the knife I only carry for food prep, listening to footsteps I couldn't place and waiting for morning like it was a thing I had to earn. I didn't sleep at all after that. I just drifted in and out of that awful half state where every sound jerks you fully awake again. Once the rain weakened near dawn, I heard two distinct steps near the front of the tent, then silence so complete it made my ears ring. I stayed still. I don't know how long. Long enough for the gray daylight to finally start bleeding through the fabric. When it was light enough to move, I packed with my hands, not really cooperating. Everything felt swollen and slow. I didn't eat. I didn't bother with coffee. I just got out of there and kept walking until the trailhead came into view, and my shoulders finally dropped about half an inch. There were other people there by then, just ordinary day users, muddy shoes, dogs, somebody arguing gently about where they'd left sunscreen in the car. Seeing them felt almost insulting after that night, like the world had switched back while I was still somewhere else. I talked to a ranger before I left, mostly because once I started the story, it sounded bad enough that keeping it to myself felt stupid. I didn't tell it dramatically, I just said what I saw. Footprints, whistles, the rock, the person on the ridge. He listened, took it seriously enough not to make me feel dumb, and then asked a couple of questions about where exactly I'd camped and which direction I'd been moving. Then he checked the registrations for that section. Nobody had signed up for it that weekend besides me. Maybe somebody was out there without doing what they were supposed to do. That's the obvious answer. People ignore systems all the time. But I still come back to those prints in the sand, how they kept turning up behind mine, then ending right where I'd stopped, like someone was close enough to know exactly when I would pause. The ranger said there wasn't supposed to be anyone else on that stretch, and I still don't know whose footprints I kept finding, mine every time the trail opened up. The next one has a completely different kind of wrong to it. I was standing beside my car with my keys in my hand, trying to unlock it without looking panicked, when I noticed the dark pickup parked 3 spaces over. It hadn't been there when I came out of the woods, I'm sure of that. The lot had looked almost cheerful a few minutes earlier, families unloading strollers, kids in those tiny bright hiking shoes, somebody passing around a bag of chips like they were at a soccer game. I remember feeling stupidly relieved by all of it, embarrassed even, like I'd spent the last couple of hours winding myself up over ordinary rural stuff I didn't understand because I was still new to being out there alone. Then I saw the truck. 2 men sat inside with the windows up. Neither one moved. They weren't talking to each other. They were just facing forward, the way people do when they're waiting for somebody to come out of a store. I recognized both of them immediately, even though I'd only seen them for a second earlier in the woods. That's the moment I realized the relief had come too soon. The reason I was out there at all was honestly not some lifelong love of hiking. It was because my doctor looked at my blood work a little over a year earlier, leaned back in his chair, and told me in the gentlest possible way that I needed to stop treating exercise like something I might get around to someday. Nothing dramatic, just middle-aged consequences arriving right on schedule. Borderline blood pressure, extra weight, the usual stuff you tell yourself you'll handle after the next busy month. Then the next one, then somehow it's been years. Walking turned into short local trails, then slightly longer ones. I didn't become some outdoors expert. I just found out I liked having a reason to put my phone away for a while. I was still not especially comfortable alone in the woods. I don't think that ever fully went away. Every crack of a branch still made me think of an animal or a person before I could talk myself down. But I kept going because it was working. I felt better, I slept better. My knees hurt less when I climbed stairs, that was enough. A few weeks before this happened, somebody in an online hiking group mentioned a lesser-known route out in the Red River Gorge backcountry. Not one of the busier, clearly maintained recreational trails. More of a rough route that connected older paths and unmarked sections if you knew where to look. The comments under it made it sound like a hidden gem. Quiet, scenic, less crowded. One guy said it was great if you wanted to avoid the weekend bottlenecks near the more popular arches. I saved the directions and figured I'd try it on a Saturday morning. Looking back, even that should made me pause. I was still new enough that I should stuck to the obvious trails. But the weather was nice, I left early, and I told myself I was being adventurous in a reasonable way. The route seemed legitimate at first. There were old trail markers here and there, faded but present. The path itself was visible enough. Narrow but not suspiciously so. I had one of those cheap hydration packs that squeaks when the chest strap isn't sitting right, and I kept adjusting it while I walked because the sound was driving me crazy. I also had a grocery store baggie of almonds in my side pocket and a peanut butter sandwich getting flattened in the top compartment. Real expert setup. For the first hour or so, everything felt quiet but normal, that's important. Nothing about it felt like I had stepped into a movie. It was just a less maintained trail in a beautiful area. Damp leaves, limestone underfoot, the smell of wet earth and old wood. A little cooler down near the shaded sections, no big deal. Then I came around a bend and saw fresh ATV tire tracks cutting across part of the route. That stood out because the section I was on was closed to vehicles. I knew that much because I'd looked up the area the night before and read one of the park pages twice just to make sure I wasn't blundering onto something I shouldn't. The tracks were deep and recent, the mud still holding the tread sharply. For maybe 10 seconds I stopped and considered turning around. Then I did what I kept doing all day. I found a reasonable excuse. Maintenance crews, I thought. Or maybe somebody with access. Maybe the closure was more technical than strict. Maybe I was misunderstanding where exactly I was on the map. I had a screenshot of the route, not some fancy GPS setup. So I took a picture of the tracks, mostly for my own reference, and kept going. I noticed after that how aware I was of being alone. Not in a poetic way, in a practical way. No voices carried from anywhere, no dogs barking in the distance, no occasional laughter from some unseen group farther up a ridge. Just woods, dense enough in sections that the light went greenish and cool. I could hear my own breathing, which got louder whenever the trail climbed. Every time I stopped, the silence around me felt like something physical, like stepping into a room where the air is heavier than it should be. A little later, I found the coolers. There were 3 of them tucked under camouflage netting near a creek, back from the route just far enough that I almost missed them. I only saw the edge of one because the lid was white and caught a stripe of sun through the trees. At first, I thought maybe somebody had stashed drinks there for a hunting trip. People do leave things in the woods. Then I got closer and saw how intentionally hidden they were. Not just left, concealed. The netting was weighed down with branches. One cooler had duct tape wrapped around the handles. There were no chairs, no campfire remains, no obvious sign of a legal campsite. Just those coolers set low near the cray, like someone wanted them out of sight but easy to return to. I didn't touch anything. I didn't even step all the way off the path. I just stood there with my mouth dry and my hand on my pack strap, thinking through the possible harmless versions one at a time. Storage for a hunting camp, somebody's private property, illegal dumping, maybe. Weird, sure, but not necessarily dangerous. Then a drone came up through the trees. I heard it before I saw it, that mosquito whine getting sharper until it broke into the open space above the creek and stopped almost directly over me. It hovered there for what was probably less than a minute, but it felt longer because I kept waiting for it to move, as if I was just incidental. It didn't. It held position and angled slightly, like it was getting a better look. I remember doing the dumbest thing possible and giving it a little half wave, the same way you do when somebody's Ring camera catches you approaching a porch. Because part of me still wanted it to be innocent. Maybe land survey work, maybe a hobbyist, maybe anything. Then it drifted backward and flew deeper into the woods. At that point, I should have turned around immediately. I know that now. Instead, I kept waiting for several more minutes because I didn't want to admit I was scared. That's the ugly middle-aged truth of it. I was so determined not to be the guy who gets spooked by every unfamiliar thing that I stayed in a place my body had already decided was wrong. Not long after that, I heard engines start somewhere farther in. Not close, muffled, but definitely engines. More than one, I think. The sound bounced around enough that I couldn't place the direction cleanly, and that was almost worse. There weren't supposed to be roads anywhere near that section. I stood still, listening, trying to figure out if it was distant traffic somehow carrying weird through the ridges, but it had that stop-start rumble of vehicles idling roughly. That was when my stomach finally dropped. I turned around and started back the way I'd come, not running, because I didn't trust my footing and I was already breathing too hard, but moving quickly enough that the hydration pack kept slapping between my shoulder blades. Every few minutes I glanced behind me. Nothing. No voices, no drone again. Just the engines fading, then returning, then fading. The walk back felt longer than the hike in, which is probably obvious. Once your nerves go, distance changes shape. I kept replaying the coolers in my head, the netting, the ATV tracks, the drone. I told myself over and over that the smart thing was just to get to a busier trail and leave. That was all. No drama. Wrong turn, lesson learned, go home. And for a while that seemed to work. I found the main trail again and not long after that, reached a parking area with actual people in it. Families, a couple in camp chairs, 2 teenage boys throwing a football badly. A woman is trying to get sunscreen onto a kid who clearly did not want sunscreen on him. It was the most ordinary scene in the world, and it hit me so hard I almost laughed. That was the false finish of it, I guess. The point where I let myself come back down. Once other people were around, I started constructing an explanation that made me feel silly but safe. I'd wandered through private property being used for hunting or storage. The drone belonged to somebody checking on equipment. The engines were ATVs somewhere beyond a boundary I hadn't realized I'd crossed. Embarrassing, yes. Criminal conspiracy, no. I sat on a low stone border near the lot, drank warm water, and texted my wife that I was heading home. I even considered grabbing my sandwich and eating before I drove because my hands had finally stopped shaking. Then I looked up and saw the dark pickup. It was backed into a spot near the edge of the lot. Plain dark paint, dusty lower panels, one missing hubcap. Nothing theatrical about it, just a truck. But through the windshield I could see the driver and passenger well enough to recognize them as the 2 men I'd glimpsed earlier near the creek, standing partly behind brush when I first noticed the hidden coolers. At the time, I'd only registered shapes in dark jackets before I kept moving. Seeing them clearly at the trailhead closed the gap in my head so fast it made my chest tighten. They had not wandered out there by chance. I unlocked my car, got in, locked it again immediately, and started the engine. I didn't gun it out of the lot, because I suddenly became very aware that acting panicked in front of them might be the wrong move. I just left. Slow at first, then normal speed once I hit the road. In the mirror, the truck pulled out too. I told myself not to decide too soon. One vehicle leaving behind another means nothing on a road out of a trail area. There are only so many directions to go. I kept driving. The truck stayed behind me. Through one curve, then another. Past a church with a white signboard. Past a mailbox shaped like a fish. I remember stupid details when I'm scared. A crushed soda can on the shoulder. A dog lying under a porch. My fingers felt slick on the steering wheel even though the air conditioner was on full. 5 miles, I thought. See if it stays for 5 miles. It did. 10 miles then. It did. By then, I had moved the phone onto the passenger seat with the local sheriff's office number half typed in. My brain was working in these clumsy layers. Don't speed. Don't lead them somewhere empty. Don't go straight home. Find people. Find lights. Keep moving. The truck never got aggressively close. That would have been easier in a way. It just stayed there, same distance more or less, like it knew it didn't need to rush me. At around 20 miles, I saw a gas station ahead with enough cars around it to matter, and I pulled in fast enough that my tires chirped a little. I parked right in front, left my car running, and went straight inside. My legs felt strange, like they belonged to somebody older than me. The clerk was a young guy with a beard and a name tag that said Mason. I remember that because I grabbed the counter and said, "Mason, I need you to call local deputies right now. I think I've been followed from a trailhead." He looked past me through the window immediately. The truck had pulled in too, then stopped near the edge of the lot without coming up to the pumps. Mason didn't argue or do the thing some people do, where they try to calm you down before they've decided if you're worth believing. He picked up the phone. I stood there next to the coffee station, pretending to stir a cup I didn't want, while watching the truck through the glass. I could smell burnt coffee and floor cleaner and hot dog roller grease, which is not a smell I'd ever usually be grateful for, but I was. Enough people were coming and going that the normal noise of the place felt like shelter. A deputy got there faster than I expected, maybe because the clerk sounded serious. Maybe because it wasn't far. By the time the deputy pulled in, the truck had started moving again. It didn't peel out. It didn't do anything dramatic. It just rolled out of the lot and disappeared down the road. The deputy took my statement, then stayed until it was clear they weren't circling back. He asked if I wanted an escort partway home. I said yes before he finished the sentence. I never went back to that section. Not to prove anything, not to get closure, not even with other people. I was too new to that kind of terrain to play games with my own pride after that. The whole point of hiking had been to improve my health, and there I was standing in a gas station, feeling like my heart was trying to beat through my shirt because I hadn't listened to the first clear sign to leave. What unsettled me later was that it didn't stay personal. A few months after it happened, somebody in that same hiking group posted about finding hidden sites in another backcountry area nearby. Coolers and the eraser brush. Vehicle tracks where they shouldn't have been. People telling them to mind their own business and keep moving. The details weren't identical, but they were close enough that I sat there staring at the screen longer than I should have. I can still picture those coolers near the creek and that truck easing out behind me, and what bothers me most now is the possibility that I didn't walk into one strange day in the woods. I might have just crossed the edge of something that had already been happening there for a while. This last story is the one that sticks with me the most. I was already running when I decided I needed to leave the trail completely. Not jogging for pace, not trying to make good time, actually running downhill where I shouldn't have been taking that kind of speed because the roots were slick and the light was going bad, and my pack kept thumping against my spine hard enough to throw me off balance. Every few seconds, I looked back over my shoulder, even though I knew that was how you eat dirt on a descent. I didn't care. I kept doing it anyway. A couple coming uphill moved aside to let me pass, and I could tell from their faces that I looked wrong. Not injured exactly, just wrong. The guy started to say something like, "Hey, you okay?" but I was already beyond him, and the girl only turned halfway before they disappeared behind me. That's one of the parts that messed with me later. There were other people on the trail. I wasn't in some untouched wilderness with nobody around for 50 miles. There were parking areas, day hikers, dogs, and little clusters of people taking photos at overlooks. Help existed in theory the whole time. It just never lined up with the part where I needed it. By the time I reached the lot, daylight had gone thin and blue. My hands were shaking badly enough that I dropped my keys once between the driver's seat and the center console. I locked the doors before I even had the engine on. Then I sat there breathing through my mouth because my throat had tightened up, and I kept expecting to see someone step out of the trees at the edge of the gravel. To explain why I was that panicked, I have to go back about 6 hours. I spend most summers doing day hikes and trail notes for a small outdoor blog I keep. Nothing big. I'm not some influencer with sponsors and drone footage and branded jackets. It's mostly route write-ups, photos of trail conditions, where the boardwalk is busted, whether the bugs are awful yet, and which overlooks are worth the extra spur. Stuff like that. I started it because friends kept texting me for recommendations, and then eventually strangers started reading it too. I liked having a reason to pay close attention when I was outside. So getting out onto a remote section of the Superior hiking trail that day felt routine. Good weather, decent visibility, a trail I'd been near before, even if not that exact stretch. I had my camera, a notebook with damp warped pages from living in my pack all summer, 2 granola bars, 1 orange, and a backup battery wrapped in a sock because I forgot the proper case at home. Normal day. I figured I'd get photos, log a couple muddy sections, maybe write later that evening about how the late season light looked over the ridges. The first thing that felt off was so small I almost didn't notice it. I was near an overlook, one of those places where the trail opens and you can actually breathe a little because the trees stop crowding you, when I heard a single clap from somewhere in the woods to my left. No a T-bird sound, not branch snap, a clap, 2 hands, 1 time. It echoed enough that I couldn't locate it exactly. And I remember barely reacting because there had been a few other hikers in the area earlier. I assumed somebody was signaling to a friend who'd wandered down a side path or maybe calling attention to a view. People clap for weird reasons outdoors. To get attention, to make a joke, to scare up a friend who stopped to pee. It didn't mean anything on its own. I even wrote for a minute after that, sitting on a flat rock with my notebook balanced on my knee. I noted that the overlook had enough room for maybe 6 people before it felt cramped, and that the wind was stronger there than in the tree cover. My pen skipped because the paper had gone soft from humidity. Totally normal stuff. As I kept moving, the day stayed regular in all the ways that make later details so annoying to explain. The ground was a mix of rooty sections and packed dirt with some damp patches where water had sat from earlier rain. Mosquitoes were mostly gone by then, which felt like a gift. The air had that cool, clean smell northern trails get toward the end of summer. Wet leaves and stone and dark water somewhere nearby. I stopped twice to take photos, once of a boardwalk section and once of a ridge opening that probably looked better in person than it ever would on the blog. An hour or so later, after I'd put real distance behind the overlook, I heard the clap again. Same sound, same kind of echo. What bothered me wasn't just hearing it twice. It was that it seemed to come from the same apparent distance away as the first one. Like whoever made it hadn't gotten farther or closer despite the miles between where I was now and where I'd first heard it. That didn't feel possible in any clean way, so I immediately started reaching for explanations. Sound carries weirdly in the woods. Maybe there was a road or a campsite off to one side, and I was hearing some repeated noise from there. Maybe another hiker had the same habit and happened to be leapfrogging me without us ever crossing. The brain loves to turn one weird coincidence into a pattern if you let it. So I did not let it, at least not yet. I kept going and told myself to focus on the actual work. Trail notes, photos, water, pace. I passed 2 older guys coming the opposite direction with trekking poles and 1 very fluffy dog, and just seeing other human beings for a second reset me. That's the exposed part of it, I think. You feel safer because there are people around, because this is a known trail, and because someone else would notice if anything was truly off. But then they keep going, and 5 minutes later, you're alone again with the same question in your head. The next wrong note was at a stream crossing. Nothing dramatic, just a muddy bank where a lot of hikers would naturally step to avoid the slick rocks. I was lining up my footing when I looked down and saw prints in the mud that didn't match the boots. Bare human footprints, fresh enough that the edges still held. 1 partial heel, then a full impression, then another. I crouched without thinking and stared at them way too long. The air there was cool enough that my fingers had gone numb when I uncapped my water. Bottled 10 minutes earlier. Not freezing, but definitely not weather where somebody would be comfortably walking a forest trail barefoot, especially not through mud and rock. The prints weren't tiny either, adult-sized. Again, I went looking for the non-scary version. Maybe someone had crossed there in water shoes that left a weird shape. Maybe a shoe sole had peeled off. Maybe I was reading the impression wrong because the mud had softened around the edges. But even as I thought that, I could see toe marks, clear enough that I stood back up with my stomach starting to tighten. I checked the area around the crossing for the owner. Nobody. No backpack leaned against a tree, no voice, no movement, just the water over rock and a few insects whining low near the bank. That was the point where I became aware of another thing that had been happening without me naming it. Every time I stopped moving, the woods went completely silent for maybe 10 or 15 seconds before the normal sound came back. Not quiet, silent, no bird calls, no leaves, no insect buzz. Like everything had paused and was waiting to see what I would do. The first time I fully noticed it, I was so unsettled I actually laughed once under my breath, which is something I do when I'm trying not to let myself spiral. I told myself I was just paying more attention now, which seemed bigger. I told myself maybe my own noise had been masking lighter sounds, and when I stopped, it took a few seconds for me to register the background again. Then it happened the next time I paused, and the next. The silence would drop over the trail like a blanket for just long enough to make me feel the skin on my arms tighten. Then the woods would slowly restart. A bird somewhere far off, leaves moving, water if I were near it, normal life. I started testing it without wanting to admit that was what I was doing. I'd stop for no practical reason, hold still, and count in my head. It kept happening. By then, I was no longer having a good time. That's the simplest way to put it. I was still hiking, still taking the trail one section at a time, but I had shifted into that tense, self-conscious mode where you become aware of every movement you make. How loud does your pack sound? How often are you checking behind you? Whether you're telegraphing fear to something you cannot yet define. I passed another small group around early afternoon, college age maybe, all bright shirts and snack wrappers and easy conversation. One of them asked if the overlook ahead was worth it. I'd said, yeah, probably, and almost added, have you heard clapping? Have you seen anyone barefoot? Is there somebody out here messing with people? I didn't, because saying it out loud would have made me sound unhinged, and they would have either laughed or looked at me with that polite concern people use when they think your problem is internal. After they moved on, I stood there for a second and listening to their voices fade. Then the woods went silent again. By late afternoon, I had mostly stopped taking photos. I just wanted to finish the section, get back to the car, and sort my thoughts in a place with windows and a steering wheel and a phone signal. I kept telling myself that if I saw one normal thing that explained the rest, I'd be embarrassed and move on with my life. Somebody's weird trail game, some local habit, one very strange barefoot hiker, something. The clearing where it finally happened wasn't large, more like a gap where the trees thinned enough to create a shallow open lane, maybe 30 feet across, with brush low on the ground and taller trunks framing it. I was walking into the angle of late light, that yellow-gray kind that makes depth hard to read, when I looked across and saw a person standing between two trees. My first reaction wasn't terror, it was relief. There you are, I thought. Great, a person, an actual person. They were standing maybe 40 feet away, partly in shadow, and from the shape of the mum it looked like they were facing away from me, shoulders slightly forward, head angled down a little. No bright clothing, nothing I could immediately identify, just a figure in dull colors. I stopped. At the same moment, they seemed to stop more completely. They too, if that makes sense. I shifted my weight to one side to get a better angle around the brush. The figure shifted too. Not turned, not looked back, shifted. Same direction, same amount, while still appearing to face away from me. I froze, then took one careful step to my left. The figure mirrored it, exactly. That's when the relief vanished so fast it felt like a physical drop inside my chest. I remember my scalp prickling under my hat. My mouth went dry. I told myself there had to be some angle trick happening, some illusion from the trees, that the person was actually facing me or partly sideways anyway, and my brain was reading it wrong because of the light. So I moved again, sharper this time. The figure matched it again. I don't know why I stepped off the trail. Instinct maybe. Curiosity mixed with adrenaline. One pace into the brush, enough to change the sightline. The person slipped behind a tree no wider than a telephone pole and disappeared. Not ran, not turned and sprinted, just moved behind it. And when I took another step to keep them in view, there was nobody there. Nisso leg visible on one side, No shoulder on the other. No sound of somebody crashing through the undergrowth. Nothing. Just that narrow trunk and the space around it. Every part of me said, leave. Do not investigate. Do not call out. Do not prove to yourself that there must be a logical explanation. Leave. I backed onto the trail and started moving fast. Within 20 seconds, that turned into the run I opened with, because once I committed to leaving, all the earlier details piled on at once. The claps, the footprints, the silences, the way the figure had matched me without turning. I kept expecting to hear somebody behind me on the trail, not because I heard them, but because it felt impossible that something could be that wrong and then simply let me go. I passed the couple on the uphill section. The end farther down, I passed a family near a creek pullout, the dad trying to get a little kid to keep his shoes out of the water. Normal voices, normal people. Nobody is stopping me. Nobody is asking the right question. I didn't stop either. I didn't want to be the guy breathlessly telling strangers in a parking lot that somebody in the woods had maybe mirrored him from across a clearing. I just wanted my car. Once I reached it, I left immediately. No snack, no regroup. No one looks down the trail. I abandoned the rest of the route. The photos I still meant to take. The whole original plan for the day. I drove until I had enough bars on my phone to call a friend and keep talking. Mostly so I didn't have to sit alone with the sound of my own thoughts. I never went back to investigate what I saw, and I think that's the only reason the story stayed a story instead of becoming something worse. People always say they would have checked, walked over, called out, looked behind the tree. Maybe. But when you're there, your body decides before your pride does. You find out what kind of person you actually are. What still bothers me isn't even the figure, not really. People can hide in the woods. People can move quietly. People can do weird things for reasons I don't understand. The part I still can't fit anywhere is the clapping. I heard the same single clap hours apart from what felt like the same distance off trail, no matter how far I had already hiked. And that's the one detail I still don't know what to do with.